Disclaimer: it's inspired by reality, shaped by imagination.
The stage of The View has seen countless clashes, but none quite like this. When Hollywood legend Harrison Ford sat down across from Joy Behar to debate one of the most controversial questions of family responsibility, should adult children be legally required to provide for their parents in old age, the sparks started before the first commercial break. Harrison, calm but firm, spoke from the heart about loyalty, duty, and the lessons passed through generations. Joy, sharp as ever, fired back with her trademark mix of humor and biting critique, arguing that forced responsibility strips people of freedom. What followed was not just a debate, but a battle of values. Tradition versus independence, love versus law, and the deepest fears of aging and abandonment. The cameras opened on The View's iconic table, the hosts seated in their familiar spots. But this morning there was something different in the air. Even the studio audience sensed it. The kind of buzz that comes when an unexpected guest is about to stir things up. The guest in question? Harrison Ford. Known for his legendary roles, his gruff humor, and his preference for privacy over public debates, his presence already carried weight. Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward with a grin as she welcomed him. "Ladies and gentlemen, Harrison Ford. We're about to get into a pretty heated topic today, so buckle up." The audience erupted into applause. Harrison gave his classic half-smile, that mix of charm and irritation, and waved it off like he wasn't here for the fanfare. He leaned into the mic, gravel still in his voice. "Thanks. I'll keep it short. I'm not used to this much talking unless it's in a script." Laughter rippled across the set, easing the tension for a moment. But Joy Behar wasted no time steering the ship. She leaned in, eyes sharp, smile tight. "Harrison, the topic today, should adult children be legally required to provide for their parents in old age? Well, it's one thing to play the hero on screen, but are you really suggesting people should be forced by law to take care of mom and dad? Because that sounds less like Indiana Jones and more like Big Brother." The audience laughed, but it was nervous laughter, the kind that comes when you sense something heavier is around the corner. Harrison tilted his head, unamused. "It's not about playing a hero. It's about responsibility. Look, I've seen too many families abandon their parents when they're at their weakest. We live in a culture where independence is worshipped, but at what cost? People grow old, they get sick, and suddenly they're discarded. You think that's freedom? I think that's cruelty." The crowd clapped, some nodding fiercely. Joy smirked and leaned back. "Oh, please. Cruelty is making a struggling adult child, maybe raising kids of their own, foot the bill for everything. Do you realize how many people are drowning in student loans, mortgages, childcare? Now you want to add a legal obligation to care for their parents on top of that? That's not compassion, that's punishment." The first real tension crackled across the stage. Whoopi and Sonny Hostin exchanged frances, sensing where this might go. Ana Navarro scribbled something on her notepad, already looking ready to jump in. Harrison didn't flinch. He adjusted in his chair, voice steady but firm. "Joy, I'm not saying it's easy. Nothing important ever is. But the fact is, parents sacrifice for their kids. Decades of hard work, sleepless nights, putting food on the table. Then when the roles reverse, what? We just shrug and say, sorry, too busy? That's not family. That's abandonment." The words landed like a hammer. The audience clapped again, louder this time, though a few voices booed. Joy pounced on the hesitation. You're acting like every parent is a saint. Not every mom or dad earns that loyalty. Some parents neglect their kids. Some abuse them. Some are downright toxic. You want to write a law that forces those same kids to support them in old age? Forgive me, but that's outrageous. Gasps came from the audience. Some nodded at Joy's point. Others groaned. For a moment, Harrison paused. His face hardened, his jaw set, and then he leaned forward, eyes locked on Joy. You're right, not every parent is perfect. But laws aren't written for exceptions. They're written for the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is millions of elderly people who can't afford care, who are lonely, who are dying without dignity. If family won't step up, then who will? That line hit the studio hard. You could almost feel the split down the middle, half the crowd applauding, half muttering under their breath. Whoopi raised her hand, trying to keep the peace. Okay, let's keep it civil. We've got a lot of ground to cover. But the fire was already lit. Joy leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. You know, Harrison, you sound like you want the government in everybody's living room. What happened to personal freedom? To choosing how you live and who you support? If love has to be enforced by law, is it really love anymore? Harrison shot her a look that could cut steel. This isn't about love. It's about duty. Love is a choice. Duty is not. If your parents gave you life, the least you can do is give them dignity when theirs is winding down. The audience erupted again, this time louder, messier, divided. Applause clashed with boos, creating a storm of noise that filled the studio. Ana Navarro finally jumped in and threw up her hands. Hold on. This is exactly why this debate matters. People out there are living this reality every day. Families are being pulled apart by guilt, by money, by obligation. Harrison's right that too many elders are forgotten, and Joy's right that too many kids are stretched to their breaking point. This isn't black and white. The studio applauded Anna's balance, but the spark between Harrison and Joy was undeniable. They weren't interested in middle ground. Sonny Hostin leaned in gently, trying to ground the discussion. Maybe the real question is whether society should step in through stronger safety nets, better elder care programs, so families aren't left fighting over scraps. The law doesn't have to mean kids are bankrupted, but it could mean no elder is left completely abandoned. But Joy wasn't about to let Harrison off the hook. She turned back to him, her smile back again but sharper than before. So, Harrison, tell us, do you think if someone's barely making rent, the government should come knocking on their door to demand they pay for their parents' nursing home? That's what you're suggesting. Harrison exhaled slowly, visibly frustrated. What I'm suggesting is that we stop pretending this is somebody else's problem. We owe the people who raised us more than excuses. And just like that, the room erupted again, half the audience standing to applaud, the other half booing loudly. The clash was no longer simmering, it was roaring to life. The cameras cut to commercial, but the tension lingered. Everyone knew this was only the beginning. When the cameras came back from commercial, the tension at the table hadn't cooled. It had thickened, almost tangible. Harrison Ford leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight, the kind of expression he usually reserved for moments of silent intensity in a film. Joy Behar, by contrast, sat upright with a gleam in her eye, as if she knew she had him exactly where she wanted him. Whoopi tried to lighten the mood with her trademark wit. Okay, folks, welcome back. If you thought the break would mellow things out, well, you don't know this table. Laughter bubbled in the audience, but it couldn't mask the electricity between Joy and Harrison. Joy leaned forward first, breaking the uneasy silence. Look, Harrison, I get where you're coming from, but let's be real here. Forcing adult children to legally take care of their parents is not compassion, it's coercion. You might as well handcuff them together and hope for the best. The audience laughed, but it was edged with discomfort. Harrison shifted in his seat, his voice low but unwavering. "That's not funny, Joy. This isn't about handcuffs. It's about a society that's lost its sense of duty. I've seen parents who worked their whole lives, gave everything, and end up in nursing homes where no one visits them. No one. They're forgotten. And you call it freedom. I call it disgrace." The audience erupted, with applause, though just as many groans filled the air. It was becoming clear that the audience was just as divided as the panel. Sunny Hostin raised her hand gently, her voice calm. "Harrison, I don't disagree that too many elders are left behind, but legal enforcement, that's where I struggle. You're essentially punishing children for a system that's already broken. Healthcare costs, elder care, housing. Shouldn't we be focusing on fixing the system instead of turning family love into a legal requirement?" "Exactly," Joy snapped, seizing the momentum. "Sunny's right. You're pushing responsibility onto individuals who are already drowning. Why not demand better social services, more community support, instead of blaming the children?" Harrison turned sharply to Joy, his eyes narrowing. "Because children aren't strangers. They're not taxpayers sending money into some faceless system. They are family. If your own parents don't matter enough for you to sacrifice, what does? Tell me, Joy, what's more important than the people who gave you life?" That landed like a thunderclap. The audience roared, cheers, gasps, and shouts. Joy's face hardened. She wasn't used to being spoken to with such raw intensity. "Don't lecture me about sacrifice," Joy fired back, her voice rising. "I know what it means to care for family. But I also know what it means to set boundaries when it's toxic, when it's abusive, when it's financially impossible. You want to make a one-size-fits-all law? That's not compassion, it's tyranny." The audience gasped again, some standing to cheer, others booing loudly. Ana Navarro jumped in, voice loud enough to cut through. Hold on. I think both of you are missing something. Look, my family's from a culture where multi-generational living is normal. You don't need a law to tell you to take care of your parents. It's part of who you are. But America isn't built that way anymore. People move, families break apart. You can't legislate love, Harrison, and you can't legislate culture, Joy. The audience applauded Anna's words, but the clash between Harrison and Joy was only intensifying. Harrison turned toward her, his voice sharp but not unkind. "Anna, I respect that. But here's the thing. When culture fails, law steps in. We make laws to protect children from neglect, to protect workers from exploitation, to protect the vulnerable from being cast aside. Why should the elderly be any different?" "Because," Joy cut in, practically slamming her hand on the table, "you're talking about forcing grown adults into situations that might destroy their lives. People already work 2, 3 jobs to survive, Harrison, and now you want to drag them into court because they can't pay for a parent's care? That's madness." Harrison leaned in, his voice gravelly but strong. "You call it madness, I call it morality." The audience erupted again, half standing to cheer, half booing so loudly that Whoopi had to raise her voice above the noise. All right, hold it down. We still have 2 more segments before someone jumps across this table." But everyone knew it wasn't cooling down. Harrison Ford and Joy Behar weren't backing away. They were digging in, and the emotional stakes were climbing higher by the second. The debate had started as sparks. Now it was fire.
The atmosphere in the studio had shifted. What began as a sparring match of principles was quickly turning into something more raw, more personal. You could feel it. The tension had stopped being about laws or policy. It was about lives, about pain, about the things people rarely say out loud until they're forced to. Joy Behar leaned back, shaking her head as the audience noise finally calmed. She spoke in a quieter voice now, almost like she wanted to bring the focus inward. You know, Harrison, I don't sit here making jokes because I don't care. I make jokes because if I didn't, I'd cry. My parents, God rest their souls, they struggled. They worked themselves to the bone. And when they got older, I did what I could. But there were limits. There were times when I couldn't be there, when I couldn't pay the bills, when I couldn't fix everything. The audience went still. Joy almost never pulled back the curtain like this. She continued, her tone sharper now, but heavy with emotion. And you know what? I carried that guilt for years. I still do. But do I think a law would have changed anything? No. It would have crushed me even more. It would have turned my grief into punishment. Harrison's face softened just slightly. He didn't jump in right away, didn't cut her off. Instead, he looked down at the table for a moment, almost as if he was debating whether to say what he was about to. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, steadier. I know what that guilt feels like, he said, eyes lifting to hers. My parents, they weren't rich. My father was in advertising. My mother was a homemaker. When they got older, it hit me that I'd been so wrapped up in my own life, my career, my family, that I wasn't there as much as I should have been. I missed things. I wasn't present. And when they passed, I realized there were no second chances. That guilt, it doesn't fade. It just stays. The audience went completely silent. Harrison Ford, stoic, legendary Harrison Ford, wasn't just an actor in this moment. He was a son who carried regret. His voice thickened as he continued. That's why I believe in this so strongly. Because when there's no framework, no accountability, people slip through the cracks. Parents are left alone, abandoned. And kids, like me, end up living with ghosts. Gasps filled the room. A few audience members visibly wiped tears. But Joy, however, was not swayed. Her eyes softened at his story, but her words came back firm, almost maternal in tone. Harrison, that's your pain speaking, and I respect it, I really do. But you can't turn your regret into law for everyone else. People have complicated families. People have parents who hurt them, abused them, abandoned them. What about those kids? Do you want to chain them to people who broke them? The crowd broke into applause, some standing in agreement. Others looked conflicted, torn between sympathy for Harrison and resonance with Joy's point. Harrison sat up straighter, his voice tightening. I'm not saying every case is the same. There can be exceptions. But as a society, we don't get to abandon the vulnerable because some situations are complicated. We make laws based on what's right, not just on what's convenient. Sunny leaned forward, her tone earnest. But Harrison, you're asking for laws to govern emotions, to govern love. That's a slippery slope. You can't legislate kindness. He turned to her, his face lined with a mix of frustration and vulnerability. Then what's the alternative, Sonny? We let the old rot alone in their apartments? We shrug and say, that's life? We already legislate responsibility, child support, guardianship, all of it. Why is it so radical to extend that same protection to the people who raised us? The audience clapped loudly, though scattered boos punctuated the sound. Joy leaned forward again, eyes flashing. Because you're confusing obligation with devotion. You can't force devotion. You can't force love. And once you make it a law, you poison the well. You'll get visits, sure, but they'll be visits laced with resentment, with bitterness. Is that the dignity you want for parents? Pity visits? Angry checks in the mail? That line drew gasps and a ripple of applause. Harrison's brow furrowed deeply. "I'd rather a bitter visit than none at all," he said firmly, his voice trembling now with emotion. "I'd rather a parent feel someone's presence, even if it's imperfect, than die alone, forgotten, like they never mattered." The words hung heavy in the air. Several audience members were openly crying. The tension wasn't just on stage anymore. It was in the crowd, in the collective memories of everyone who'd lost someone or who had a parent growing old at home. Whoopi leaned in, voice low but resonant. "This right here is the real debate. Not the politics, not the law, the fear. The fear of being left behind. The fear of not being loved when you need it most. That's what we're hearing." The audience clapped, softer this time, more reflective. But the flashpoint had been reached. Harrison's voice had cracked, Joy had exposed her own scars, and the room was split down the middle. It no longer felt like a daytime talk show. It felt like a courtroom, a confessional, and a family argument all in one. And as Harrison and Joy stared across the table at each other, neither willing to give an inch, everyone watching knew this was far from over. The most explosive moment was still to come. The tension in the studio had reached an unbearable peak. The polite but pointed barbs that had carried the earlier parts of the debate were long gone. What remained was raw conviction, emotion stripped bare. The audience, once comfortable in their applause and laughter, now sat frozen, as though they had stumbled into a family argument too real to turn away from. Joy Behar leaned forward, her voice sharper than ever, the New York edge in her tone cutting through the air. "Harrison, let's stop dressing this up as some noble cause. What you're really talking about is forcing an entire generation into financial chains. Life is already brutal enough for young people. They're drowning in debt. They can't afford homes. Childcare costs are through the roof. And now you want to add their parents' retirement and health care bills on top of that? That's not family. It's servitude." Her words landed like punches, each one reinforced by murmurs of agreement from younger faces in the audience. Harrison Ford, however, did not flinch. Instead, he pushed his chair back slightly, his posture stiff, his jaw set. His voice, gravelly and slow, carried the weight of someone who had thought about this long before stepping onto the stage. "You call it servitude," Harrison replied, his eyes narrowing, "but I call it responsibility. My father worked until the day his body gave out. My mother went without things she needed so I could have a chance at a life. And when their time came, when they couldn't stand on their own anymore, I didn't see it as a burden. I saw it as an honor. That's what being part of a family means. You carry one another, even when it's hard." The words sent a ripple through the audience. Some clapped, others remained silent, uncertain, caught between admiration and discomfort. Joy's lips tightened, but she fired back without missing a beat. "But Harrison, not everyone is you. Not everyone has a Hollywood bank account or the luxury to romanticize obligation. Some families are toxic. Some parents abandoned their kids, mistreated them, or worse. You can't paint all parents as selfless saints who earned the right to be cared for. Forcing children to support parents who failed them, that's not justice. That's cruelty dressed up as tradition." The crowd gasped at her bluntness, but Joy wasn't done. She jabbed her finger toward him, her voice rising. "And you're ignoring something else. Making it law, not suggestion, not encouragement, but law, means government intrusion into the most personal parts of our lives. You're inviting the state to crawl into the family living room and dictate relationships with dollar signs. That's not family values. That's surveillance." Harrison's hand slammed on the table, startling everyone.
His eyes burned with an intensity few had ever seen on daytime television. "You call it surveillance, Joy," Harrison replied, "but I call it responsibility. We already have laws that tell people how much tax to pay, what they owe in child support, even who gets custody. You know why? Because sometimes people don't do the right thing on their own. Sometimes society has to remind them of their duty." The studio erupted. Some cheered, others booed, the split sharper than ever. Joy raised her eyebrows and gave a tight smile, her trademark mix of sarcasm and defiance. "So, you want Big Brother to enforce morality now? Fine, let's go all the way. Let's legislate kindness. Let's fine people for not calling their mothers on Sunday. Let's jail people for forgetting their dad's birthday. Where does it end, Harrison?" Her sarcasm drew laughs, but Harrison wasn't laughing. His voice cracked, not from anger, but from something deeper. "It ends, Joy," he said, leaning forward, his voice trembling with memory, "when parents die alone. It ends when sons and daughters don't pick up the phone, don't show up at the hospital, don't even bother to ask if their mother has food on the table. That's where it ends, Joy, and I've seen it too many times." For a moment, silence blanketed the room. His words carried a painful sincerity that no counterpunch could easily erase. Harrison's weathered face seemed to tell a story he didn't have time to explain, a story of old parents left waiting in empty houses. The audience sat in heavy quiet, many suddenly lost in thought about their own parents or children. Joy, however, was not one to back down. She softened her tone slightly, but her words remained firm. "Harrison, I'm not saying we shouldn't take care of our parents. I'm saying the law isn't the way to do it. You can't legislate love. You can't mandate compassion. You either feel it or you don't. And if you try to force it, you risk breeding resentment instead of responsibility." Her restraint was strategic, but Harrison wasn't done either. His voice rose once more, louder now, as if he were no longer debating, but pleading. "Then what's the alternative, Joy? Letting the elderly rot in underfunded nursing homes? Letting the state foot the bill while families wash their hands of their own blood? You talk about resentment. I'm talking about abandonment. You say it can't be forced, but sometimes people need a push, because if we don't remind people of their obligations, we risk becoming a society that forgets what family even means." The clash had become too big, too raw. No witty remark, no careful moderation could bring it back to civility. The studio audience was now shouting over one another, half in support of Harrison's demand for responsibility, half cheering Joy's insistence on freedom from imposed duty. The set itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the conflict. Finally, Joy leaned back, her eyes flashing with finality. "Harrison, what you're talking about isn't family, it's coercion, and I'll never, ever support it." Harrison's eyes lingered on her for a long, heavy moment. He didn't speak. Instead, he shook his head slowly, as if he realized the debate had reached a point beyond words. His silence was more cutting than any retort. The camera zoomed in on his face, pain, conviction, and defiance all wrapped into one. The atmosphere in the studio was suffocating, the kind of silence that comes only after two forces collide with no compromise in sight. The studio felt eerily quiet, though the echoes of raised voices still seemed to linger in the air. Joy Behar leaned back in her chair, arms folded, her expression defiant but also weary. She had made her point, and she knew it. But across the table, Harrison Ford sat motionless. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the cameras. The moderator tried to smooth things over, offering a half-hearted transition to commercial, but it was clear the debate had pushed too far. What had begun as a spirited clash had turned into something heavier, more personal. Harrison finally stood up. The scrape of his chair against the floor cut through the silence, drawing every pair of eyes to him. He didn't raise his voice, didn't point a finger. He simply spoke with the kind of quiet authority that makes people lean in. "You call it coercion," he said, his gravelly voice steady. "I call it love with accountability. You can laugh at it, you can roll your eyes at it, but when you've held the hand of a parent who gave you everything and asked for nothing in return, you don't call it a burden. You call it a debt of honor. If we forget that, we forget who we are." The room was still. Joy opened her mouth as if to answer, but she didn't. For the first time in the segment, she stayed silent. Harrison's eyes swept the audience, then returned briefly to Joy. "I've said what I came to say. If people don't agree, fine. But at least I can walk out of here knowing I stood up for what I believe family is supposed to mean." And with that, he turned and walked off the set. The cameras caught the moment, the iconic actor leaving mid-broadcast, not in anger, but in conviction. The studio gasped. Some applauded, others booed, but everyone knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. Joy sat back in her chair, shaking her head with a thin smile, trying to recover her composure. "Well, I guess Harrison made his exit. I hope someone tells him we've still got another segment." The audience laughed nervously, but the tension hadn't fully lifted. When the show cut to commercial, the chatter in the studio buzzed like electricity. Viewers at home would soon flood social media with clips arguing over who was right: Joy, who warned against legislating family, or Harrison, who demanded accountability as the ultimate test of love. The clash hadn't solved the question, but it had done something else. It had forced everyone watching to look inward, to ask themselves, what do I owe the people who raised me, and what will I expect from those who come after me? That was the legacy of Harrison Ford's Walk-Off. A reminder that family isn't just about comfort or convenience. It's about the choices we make when duty collides with freedom.